eyebrows, and remarkable eyes deep sunk and piercing, like the eyes of a hawk, but ever turning restlessly from one of our faces to the other, and then to those beside him. It was the very type of a conscience-stricken face, or of one which fears an assassin. However, when the Rashid had spoken to young Abd al-Aziz, he had shown him a more gentle and fatherly side of himself. He had consoled him on the recent death of his elder brother Faisal, and said that perhaps God would cause him to grow into an able replacement. The previous spring, before Abd al-Aziz and his uncle's visit to him, the Rashid and his men had laid siege to Riyadh, the town where the Sauds lived, for more than 40 days. They had cut down almost 8,000 of the palm trees that grew in the date groves that surrounded the town, had damaged and poisoned many of the wells on which the townspeople depended. Yet still the Sauds and the 10,000 people of Riyadh had refused to surrender. As a result, as the heat of summer had come on and still Ibn Rashid's men had seen no prospect of the town surrendering, they had started to tire of the drudgery of the siege and had begun to desert. So Ibn Rashid had had no alternative but to call for negotiations. And thus it had come about that Abd al-Aziz had ridden out with his uncle to the Rashid's camp to negotiate a peace. Agreement had quickly been reached. Rashid and his men had withdrawn, allowing Abd al-Aziz's father, Abd al-Rahman, to continue to rule in Riyadh, and in return, he had recognized Ibn Rashid as overlord of the whole of Najd and continued to accept a Rashid governor for the town. However, a few months later, a fresh alliance of tribes had risen against the Rashids in the north. There had been treachery, bloodshed, and dishonor on both sides. Ancient codes of chivalry and hospitality had been drowned in blood. Thousands of men had been drawn into the struggle. For weeks, one battle or skirmish followed another, but still neither side had gained the ascendancy. Seeing his chance to finally crush the Rashids, early in January 1891, Abd al-Rahman had once again marched out at the head of his fighting men to join the tribes opposing the Rashids. However, before he could join them, news had reached him of a mighty battle near a place called Mulaida, close to the vast rolling sands of the Dana Desert. 50, perhaps 60,000 men had been involved. Men were calling it the greatest battle in all of Arabia for more than 100 years. At first, the rebel tribes had appeared to gain the upper hand, and the Rashid had seemed to withdraw. But then, the Rashid turned. Having massed several thousand camels in the center of his line, he had tied bundles of brushwood to their backs and set fire to them. Terrified, the camels had stampeded headlong straight into the rebels' lines. Ibn Rashid's infantry had followed close behind. Finally, in the confusion, he had unleashed his cavalry and mounted camel soldiers at the rebels' flanks. Many of the leaders and men of the rebel tribes had been killed or seriously wounded. The rebels had been routed. Learning of the defeat, Abd al-Rahman had turned and hurried back to Riyadh to prepare for a new siege. But the leading men of the town, hearing of what had happened, that Ibn Rashid had gathered a mighty army, that his blood was now up and he intended to show the Sauds and their subjects no mercy, had come to the palace and demanded an audience with Abd al-Rahman. Abd al-Aziz had seen the town's leading citizens arrive at the palace the previous evening, had sensed their agitation, and seen them admitted to his father's audience chamber, the Majlis. But Abd al-Aziz had not been allowed to sit in on his father's discussion with the leading citizens as he often was. Instead, he had been sent to his bed. The discussion had still been going on when he had at last fallen asleep. Riyadh's leading citizens had told Abd al-Rahman that he and his family must leave the town. They had not had sufficient time to recover from the previous siege, nor to gather in sufficient provisions to withstand another. They feared that this time Ibn Rashid would indeed show them no mercy. The Rashid and his men would not withdraw until they had crushed the town and taken vengeance. Thus it was that later that night, Abd al-Rahman roused his family and ordered that they must leave at once. Ibn Rashid's scouts had been spotted a few miles to the northwest, making their way down the great Wadi Hanifa through the outlying palm groves towards the town. There was no time to lose. Leaving his room and walking down a corridor onto the balcony above one of the palace's inner courtyards, Abd al-Aziz immediately becomes aware of muted but purposeful bustle and activity down below. Dimly lit by oil lamps, more than a dozen of the palace's most reliable writing.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.